Hey, I want to talk a bit about, and I've touched on the subject before, but I think it's very pertinent to current events, and that is the strange symbiosis between the regressive left and radical Islam. Now, just to be clear here, I am not saying that the regressive left support radical Islam. I don't think that's the case, but I do think a lot of attitudes that we've been seeing over the years, and by we I mean particularly Western societies that have suffered Islamist attacks, um, and that's small compared to the atrocities that have been going on within Muslim countries. But what we've been seeing in the wake of a lot of these attacks is a predictable trend. There will be criticism of the attack, and it will always be generic. You'll rarely see people, except those who are actually paying attention, use the word use the term Islamic extremism. What you'll get from the regressive left, the people I'm criticizing here, they'll say, "Oh, it's terrible. We condemn this terrorism." So they'll use the vague term of terrorism, and terrorism is a vague term because there's lots of terrorist groups out there with all sorts of ideologies. Probably most of the terrorist groups in the world today are Islamist. If you look at the list on Wikipedia of terrorist attacks, most of them are Islamist. Occasionally, you'll get like communist insurgents, occasionally far right groups, but most are Islamists. That's just a fact. ISIS has been defeated, but there's other groups out there like Boko Haram. In fact, I say ISIS has been defeated. They've lost their caliphate. That actually may make things more dangerous because that means they can now concentrate more on attacks rather than having to effectively run a small nation state. But anyway, let's look at an attack that wasn't Islamist recently, which is, of course, I'm referring to the Christchurch attack. An appalling atrocity. It rightly got a lot of attention because it was the worst neo Nazi attack anywhere in the world since the Norway attacks of 2011. I mean, it was an awful thing, 50 people killed in an otherwise pretty peaceful country. And it is understandable and is right that New Zealand is introspecting on tolerance and is introspecting on the threat that it faces from far right extremists like Brenton Tarrant. It's also reported that he has links to nationalist groups in Europe, financial links, and so on. And it is very possible that elsewhere there will be that sort of attack from a far right source. But overall, there has been more people killed in Islamist attacks cumulatively than far right attacks in recent years. Um, Now, I've said before, this shouldn't be some sort of sick competition to see who, whether it be Islamists or far right types who kill and terrorize the most people. It shouldn't be a competition. They're both problems. However, I do believe that there's a different response to them. Everyone, well, most people, I should say, recognize and condemn the far right. I think there's some apologists on the right who downplay its threat, and they're wrong. They shouldn't do that. It's a problem. But there are those on the left, and the reason I'm focusing on the left is because, like I say, Islamism has been the bigger problem, who simply will not call a spade a spade. What they will do is they'll condemn the attack generically, say Manchester or Paris or Brussels or Berlin or Barcelona or Orlando or any one of the other attacks that have been happening. They'll make a generic condemnation. They'll say it's awful, and they'll offer candlelit vigils, and that's fine. I think it does have a place. I wouldn't dismiss that. I think it has its place. I remember after the Manchester attack, there were even vigils here in my city in Sunderland, and it's fine. I'm not against it in itself, but I think the regressive left, and I'm careful here to say regressive left, I'm not talking about left wing people in general. So please don't think I'm being politically tribal here. I'm not talking about all left wing people. But the regressive left will make these generic condemnations, but they simply will not say Islamic extremism. Why? Why not? And sometimes that extends the leaders. Barack Obama, Sadiq Khan, Obama, in his 8 years as president, I don't think once he said Islamic extremism by name, and that's frankly pretty disgraceful. Obama had some strong points as president. He was a good orator, smart guy, um, but that to me is one of his that has to take points off his legacy for not acknowledging one of the biggest ideological extremes in the world today by name. Um, Jeremy Corbyn won't acknowledge it. He simply will you will never ever hear Jeremy Corbyn say Islamic extremism. Corbyn will say, "Oh, we stand against this terrorism. It's terrible." But there's clearly a different approach. If, for example, there was a far right attack in Britain tomorrow, God forbid, but let's say there was, let's say it was some white supremacist group, and they killed and wounded people. Jeremy Corbyn and others of his persuasion would be saying it's terrible. We need to combat racism. This is hate that drove us here. This is far right extremism. They'd be very precise about it. If an Islamist attack occurred tomorrow, Corbyn, of course, would condemn it, but he'd just say it's generic terrorism. He wouldn't call it by its name. And some people might say that's nitpicking. I don't think it is. I think it gets to the heart of the problem here, which is simple dishonesty, refusal to accept what is obvious. I've long said that you cannot divorce Islamic extremism from Islam because I mean, of course, the majority of Muslims are not terrorists, but we shouldn't even have to say that. It's just obvious. However, in Islamic countries, what you get is a situation where people they'll condemn terrorism, but very often the same people will want the death penalty for blasphemers. So they'll condemn the Taliban, they'll condemn ISIS, they'll call them terrorists, they'll say it's awful, and they'll say it's got nothing to do with Islam. But then, as soon as someone's accused of blasphemy, they'll endorse potentially the death penalty for that. I mean, look at what's happened in Brunei. That isn't a terrorist group that's doing it, that's a nation state. So I believe that Islam is basically incompatible with human rights and democracy. I do believe that there is a reformist Muslim movement, and I support it. But I believe it's an uphill struggle, and I think that they need as much support as they can get. Islam isn't going to go away. It's a major world religion, and there's millions of decent, ordinary Muslims who are just getting on with their lives. But Islam has a fundamental problem with human rights. It's just a fact. So we're not just talking here about Islamic extremism in the form of terrorism. We're talking about Islamic extremism in the form of its intolerance. So I have to say, I find it very galling when liberal democracies pander to this and they churn out this nonsense about Islamophobia. What is Islamophobia? I mean, a phobia is an irrational fear of something. There's nothing irrational about being concerned about violent jihadist attacks. I personally use the term anti-Muslim bigotry to describe, for example, hate crimes against individual Muslims or hating all Muslims. That's anti-Muslim bigotry, and it's wrong. But despite everything that's happened, there is still a fundamental dishonesty, and it concerns me and it frustrates me because there's still people out there who the second they hear criticism of Islam, they'll automatically think racist, far right, bigot, and it's absolutely infuriating because all that does is actually their attitude actually enables the far right, i.e., those who genuinely are bigots who do hate all Muslims. It enables those people because it allows them to fill the vacuum. and it's just really sad. As for New Zealand, well, like I say, it's not for me to tell the people of New Zealand how they should react to this. But I did notice that Prime Minister Ardern was wearing the hijab, and she's been going out of her way to kind of pitch to the Muslim community and reach out to them. Well, that's understandable. They were the targets of this attack. So it makes sense to, reach out to them. I'm not against that. But I do wonder, is her government taking it a little bit far? I don't know. I'd be interested in what New Zealanders think of that. Because New Zealand happened to be the victim of a far right terror attack, but that could very easily have been an Islamist attack. New Zealand's a liberal democracy, and Islamists hate liberal democracy. And I wonder how it sits with Muslims that, conservative Muslims, that she attended a gay pride parade. So I'd be interested in hearing New Zealanders what they think of this. Do you think the approach that, I mean, Prime Minister Ardern's been widely praised for her response to this, and I think overall it's been good. But I do wonder, like donning the hijab and all. Um, Number one, not every Muslim woman wears a hijab, and number two, that reminds me of a wider issue. When I see Muslim women in Washington D.C. or Toronto talk about, on the Women's March wearing the hijab and talking about liberty for women, where is the solidarity? And non-Muslim women then show solidarity by wearing it. Where is the solidarity, I ask, for those brave women in Iran who risk beatings or arrest for taking their hijab off? Where's the solidarity for them? So I find that sort of virtue signaling particularly pathetic. I'm not talking about Jacinda Ardern because I understand the context there, but I'm talking about like on the Women's March. It's just somewhat perverse when you have women who are choosing to wear the hijab and the burqa and the niqab, when the fact of the matter is in conservative Islamic countries they don't have a choice. So when hijabis say that it liberates them, that it's all about, it's a modesty doctrine which itself needs to be examined, does that mean that women who don't wear it aren't modest? No one ever asks these questions because they make the mistake of think, oh, it's just an item of clothing. You can't tell other people what to wear, and that would be fine if it were true. But it's not. It's a political statement. And if you don't believe that, then just look at the rationale behind it. I wear it for modesty. That's fine. That's your right. But then, does that mean that you think other women aren't modest? I think these are legitimate questions, but they're not asked because if anyone does ask them, they're immediately denounced as a horrible bigot. So I think there is a fundamental crisis going on in liberal democracies. It's a lack of honesty. And I really find it hard to respect people who call themselves liberals, who claim to believe in human rights, and yet they are silent when it comes to the way that Islamic theocracies behave, when it comes to the massive persecution of Christians, of atheists, of Muslim minorities for that matter, and Mahdis and Sufis, and also, not to mention, the scourge of Islamic extremism in terms of attacks. But this isn't just in the form of terrorist groups. I mean, a rumor in rural Pakistan about the Prophet being offended will be enough to get someone lynched. So when I see people in the West having this knee jerk reaction whenever Islam is criticized, I want to shout at them, do you support blasphemy laws? Because you're sure as hell acting like you do. So those are a few things for people to think about. I just think it's very sad that there are useful idiots out there, people who will automatically have this reaction that if you talk about Islamic extremism, oh, you must hate all Muslims or you're far right. Look, I have contempt for the far right. I have contempt for white supremacists, and I have no time for blood and soil nationalism. I think it's an ugly, regressive ideology. And I support reformist Muslims, but the evidence there is out there shows that organized Islam, that is Islamism, as a political ideology, can never be compatible with human rights and democracy. Just can't. It will always involve persecution of minorities, and it will always involve crushing of free expression, because to criticize it would be a blasphemy.